Welcome to ITL Trainer Talk. Today we're speaking to Chip Smith of Chip Smith Performance Systems in Atlanta. The word pioneer is thrown around in the world of sports, but Chip Smith really fulfills the word like few others, at least in football. In a business that demands constant adaptation and even reinvention, Chip's been an innovator and a survivor. The field of combine prep has really only been a big part of the NFL landscape for about 15 years, but Chip has been offering it even before we knew what it was for twice as long. Chip estimates that he's nearly trained about 2,000 future NFL players in his 30 years in the business. If you think about it, that's a lot of players. Still, it's his prolific pace that's so impressive. Chip hasn't slowed down and trained as many players today as he has at any time in his career. While Chip has trained players like Champ Bailey, Brian Urlacher, Jared Allen, and James Harrison, he's trained several more in recent draft classes. Among his 2018 trainees were players like Giants third-rounder B.J. Hill, Broncos third-rounder Isaac Yiadom, Redskins fifth-rounder Tim Settle, and several others. He's expected to have another big class in 2019. Chip, it is an honor to have you on, buddy. Welcome to Trainer Talk. How you doing?
Thanks, brother. Well, I appreciate it. Thank you for those kind words. When you get old, you're either good or you're just old. So I'm pretty old.
I heard that, man. I'm right there with you. Okay, so Chip, you've trained some of the greatest players in NFL history. We listed some of them. You've gotten to see them up close over several years. They tend to be loyal and come back, and you work with some of them now, even on the coaching side. How would a great player 20 years ago fit into today's game, and would he still excel? Would he still have the skill level? Would he still be able to do the things that you need to do to be a star in today's game?
Well, yeah, to all those questions, I think that guys that played back in the day, their skill levels were certainly good enough to play today. The difference in the game, obviously, is because all the changes in the game has changed the dynamics of guys that are playing in today's world. You go back, 30 years when I first started, you didn't have, guys that are, 300 pounders. Now everybody's 300 pounders. There was only one or two guys back in the day. Now you can't play unless you're over 300. Guys are so much bigger and faster today than they were 30 years ago. But I would say unequivocally that those guys that played years ago physically were tougher. And, not to say that, the guys that play today don't have the physical acuity that other guys do. But I think years ago, because if you think about it, back when when guys played 30 years ago, you had 2-a-days, you hit every day. You had 3 a day some days, and just the physicality of the game was completely different 30 years ago than it is today. So, yeah, I do think that guys that played years ago would be stars today. I think there would be some guys that played on the offensive, defensive line that probably would have been maybe linebackers in today's game. But I think they were great athletes back then. I think they would be today as well.
You make some great points there, Chip. You're talking about how much less hitting there is today than there was 20 years ago, even 10 years ago, prior to the most recent CBA being negotiated. And I know that has made a dramatic impact on kind of players and how they play and how they feel later in the year and all those kind of things. It's something that you don't hear much about in the media anymore.
Yeah, and I think a lot of back in the day, guys didn't feel entitled. Today these kids, because they start playing at a young age and they do the 7-on-7 and they get recruited early, and the 5-star and the 3-star and all those things. Back in the day, guys just played because of the love of the game, and they recruited guys because they were great football players, not because they met any kind of measurables. And there are a lot of guys that maybe didn't meet those measurables early on that would have never got opportunity in today's world, that end up being stars, but they probably didn't run fast 40s or couldn't jump or bench 225, but they were just good football players.
Yeah, we could talk for another hour about that exact topic. That is one of the biggest changes I think we've seen, especially in the last 2 decades, maybe even 3 decades.
Right.
Okay. So every team's looking for players that have that short area burst, that short area quickness, the sudden guys that can really move quickly. Is a player born explosive, or can he be made explosive, Chip?
Well, that's a great question. For years and years and years, we were taught in school that you were born with a certain number of fast twitch muscle fibers, and if you had those, then that translated to being explosive, and you couldn't increase that. In 1987, I actually studied abroad. I went to Russia, and I studied speed development at the Soviet Sport Institute. The last white guy that won 100 meters was a guy named Valerie Borzov, I think in the 68 Olympics. So I figured if they could make white guys fast, they were onto something. So in 1987, I got selected to study abroad, and I went over there and I studied speed development and pre and post pubescent training, because the same thing, we were taught that kids couldn't start doing weight training before puberty because they would stunt growth by, closing off the epiphyseal cell long bone and stunt growth. So we didn't let kids start lifting until they went through puberty. But the East Germans and the Russians and the Eastern Bloc countries started guys at a young age. And at that time, I had little kids, and I wanted to know when was the right time to start my kids, working out. So went over there and I studied, and the Russians, in fact, said, hey, you can increase linear speed. You do that by training with resistance. You do that by training with overspeed. And so when I got back in 87, I actually developed my system that now is a national certification called the MORE. It's an acronym for movement, overspeed, resistance, and reaction. And as far as I know, I'm the only sports performance coach in the United States that has a master's program in their system. So anybody that's interested can get their master's in human performance at Liberty University in sports performance. So when I got back, I developed this system based on what I learned. And so the MORE is an acronym for movement, overspeed, resistance, and reaction. And so we train in those components. And what we found is that we're able to get anywhere from 1/10 and a half to 2/10 off of a guy's 40 time, where before we were taught that you couldn't increase linear speed, and you either had it, you didn't have it. And so, yes, in fact, you can increase that. Now it's within reason. You can't take a kid that runs a 5.6 and have him run a 4.5, but 1/10 and a half to 2/10 is pretty commonplace in the industry, and has been for us for about 30 years.
Mm-hmm. 2/10 could equal 2 or 3 rounds sometimes.
Oh, absolutely. In fact, I can tell you many stories, of the close to 2,000 guys I've put in the league. There have been a lot of guys that, I'll tell you just a quick story. There was a guy probably 10 years ago named Dwayne Robinson, who played at Kentucky. He had a third or fourth round grade. He came in at 300, running about probably five flat, and he left at 326, and he ran a 4.78, and he ended up being the fourth player taken in the first round. So it was literally worth millions. I think we figured out $15 million. It was worth to him to move up, because he increased, at that weight to speed ratio, they just freaked out. I mean, it was incredible.
Yeah, that's another good point, Chip. We hear a lot about 40 times as we go through the draft process. Very rarely do we get them indexed to their weight. When you're talking about someone who weighed 326 or whatever you told me, running a sub 5, man, that's unheard of. That's insane. That humans aren't supposed to do stuff like that.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And over the years, there's been a bunch of guys that have been moved up in the draft because of that 40. That's a soapbox for me. Neil, there's a lot of guys, and of course, being in the industry, last year at the NFL Combine, collectively the fastest position was corners, which rightfully so. And the average Combine numbers for the corners was 4.54. So when you hear guys saying they run 4.2s and 4.3s, there may be one or two, but if you run a legit 4.6 in the NFL, you're considered a burner.
Yeah, you're right. That's true. Okay. And that's laser time, of course, because hand time and laser time have such a big difference in all those.
And that's a great point. Let me point out real quick to any of your viewers. The NFL Combine is not electronic timing. Kids are like, yeah, I'm going to run electronic time. It's a handheld start and electronic finish. Mm-hmm. A true electronic time. And that's how from experience, that's how we time guys. Again, the reason we do that is because I know from experience, there's a lot of guys in my industry that can manipulate that clock. They can clock you slow coming in and fast going out. Well, here I'm like, it is what it is. If it's true electronic time and you run a 5 flat 40, if you run a 4.8 when you leave, I've decreased your time by 2/10. Mm-hmm. That's all I want to do is show improvement. How much you improve is dependent upon how hard you work. Mm-hmm. So we want to make sure that we're accurate on how we test and evaluate, because again, I don't want a guy leaving here thinking he runs, a 4.2 and he runs a 4.6. People are like, how does that happen? So.
Sure. No, you're right. All right. So Chip, here's a question that everyone really balks at, man. This is the tough one. I thought it was the best one when I first started doing these. Who's a player that sticks out in your mind, in 30 years, Maybe not necessarily your favorite player, not the guy you like, not the best player, but the guy that you connected with who maybe made an impression on you. You could tell you made an impression on them. Who would be that guy that has just kind of sticks out in your mind after 30 years? This is a guy that was a lot of fun to train and saw some results and has been even rewarding for you.
Well, that is a great question. People ask me all the time, who's the best player you ever trained, and all 2,000 guys are like family to me. So there's not one that I love more than another. But there is a story that I'm going to tell you that when you said that, just it came to mind immediately. So for 20 plus years, I've had multiple first round draft picks, and first round draft picks are first round, whether you train them, I train them, or our mamas train them. You can only screw those guys up. You point at the field and say, go play. But 4 years ago, I got a call from my father, and he goes, Coach Smith, you've been identified as from some NFL people as the best guy to train my son. And I said, well, tell me about your son. He goes, well, my son's 6'4", 285, and he plays guard. And I said, okay, that's great. I said, where does he play? And he goes, well, that's the problem. He said, my son plays at Hobart College. And I said, Hobart? And he goes, yeah. I said, is that like an NAIA school or, 1AA school? He goes, nope, it's a D3 school. And I said, really? I said, well, sir, I don't mean any disrespect to you. I said, but, being raised in the South and training SEC and ACC players, I said, I'm used to the Albert Haynesworth, Geno Atkins, the guys that are full-grown men. I said, they will eat your son alive. He goes, well, I appreciate that. He said, will you check around? I said, well, let me make a couple calls. So I called some teams, and they said, you know what? This guy's is a good D3 player, but he's not going to get drafted. So I said, I called the father back, and I said, look, I want to manage unrealistic expectations. Your son's a D3 player. I've never had a D3 player in all my years of training. So I want to make sure that you're not expecting more than what's realistic. And he goes, no, I appreciate that. And he goes, I think you'll like my son. So the young man comes in December. Obviously, he's not playing in the bowl game, and so he starts working in December. He gets in. He's 285. He weighs he's 285. He does 15 reps with 225. He runs a 5 flat 40, which was a great time for a big offensive lineman.
Sure.
So fast forward, the week before the NFL Combine, this young man gets an invitation. There's 50 Division I players there, and I'm literally scared to death that he's going to get exposed. There was a lot of deficiencies we saw in my offensive line coach, John Stinchcomb, who played 8 years and was a Super Bowl winner with the Saints and captain. He said, he's getting better every day, but he said, he's got a lot to learn. Well, the week of the NFL Combine, the kid goes to Indianapolis. He weighs in at 311. He does 31 reps with 225, and he runs a 4.8740 at 311. 1 month ago, Ali Marpet signed a $55 million deal, the highest earning for an offensive lineman in the history of the National Football League. Now, Ali Marpet, people said couldn't play, including me. I didn't say he couldn't play. I just said he's going to have a hard time playing.
Sure. And
Ali Marpet's been a 4-year starter with Tampa Bay. He didn't even have a draft grade. He's the highest drafted player ever in the history of the National Football League from the D3 program. And I don't know of anybody else that didn't have a draft grade that was drafted in the second round. So for me, and I had so much fun training Ali. Ali was like a sponge. I mean, every day he came in. You got to remember, at Hobart, they didn't have a strength coach. They didn't have facilities. In fact, when he got down here, funny story, he said, Coach, he said, in the high school football down here in Georgia, he said, like on Friday night, how many guys come to the game? I said, well, you know what? I said, that depends, Ali. But I said, there's probably 10 or 15,000. He said, really? I said, oh, yeah, every week. And I said, in fact, my son played 4 years in the state championship. And I said, they averaged, because they played in the dome, they averaged probably 35 to 40,000 people at the high school state championships. He goes, oh, my God, Coach. He said, the most I ever played in college, it was 250 people. I'm like, really? He goes, yeah. And they were all parents, So here's a guy that went from a D3 program to the National Football League playing in front of 70,000 people. He's trained with me every offseason since he's been in the league. I love this guy. He's certainly not the best athlete I've ever trained. He's not the highest guy ever drafted, but his story. Oh, and what's really crazy on top of that is he's also Jewish. So I've only had 2 Jewish players in 30 years. Another kid named Lenny Friedman that played at Duke They got drafted in the second round. But so, you know what? I mean, it was all those circumstances. So it was funny because I was actually in Dallas speaking at a conference, and I was coming back that particular day, and I was on a plane, and I'm sitting there, and I'm watching the ticker tape on the bottom of my phone, and we're sitting on the runway, and the pilot comes on, and he goes, "Hey, we're going to be delayed because we're having some engine problems." So I'm like, well, at least I'll be able to watch the draft. So I'm watching the draft. So it says with the 61st pick, the Tampa Bay Buccaneers select from Hobart College, Ali Marpet. And I throw my hands up. I said, "Yeah!" I'm screaming. Everybody around me looks at me like, you're an idiot. And I'm like, it's okay. You know, this guy was like a son to me, just got drafted. So anyway, we tell that story, and you know, Ali has just been so gracious since he got drafted. And I mean, he's put the work in and just continues to work. And, you know, he's not even close to his genetic potential. So yeah, Ali Marpet will be the story that I'll probably tell long after I'm done training guys. That probably the greatest story for me to see a guy. And you know what, Neil, what changed for me is now when I get a call from a D3 kid or a D2 kid, you know what, I don't shirk those calls anymore. I say, look, you know what, I'll never tell a kid he can't play again after having worked with, you know, Ali Marpet.
No, you're right. I understand. And I'll tell you what else, Chip, I would love to talk to Coach Stinchcomb about what y'all did from December until Senior Bowl week. Because I remember that Senior Bowl, that's a true instance of a kid who made a lot of money. Because again, he'd never seen players like what he faced in that week in Mobile, and he really, you know, acquitted himself well. And you always hear about people making money. He made a lot of money that week, not just obviously what he did at the Combine, but also what he did in Mobile.
Right. Oh, absolutely. And again, it paid off for him. $55 million is what he just signed a month ago.
Sure. Yeah, you can't argue with that. All right. So Chip, tell us if I'm a player or a parent or an agent, of course, someone else who wants to learn more about what y'all are doing in y'all's coming Combine class, where do I go? What do I do?
Yeah, you can go to Chip Smith Performance Systems. I'm also on social media. I'm at Coach Chip Smith on Twitter, Coach Chip Smith on Instagram, Chip Smith on Facebook, and then my website, CoachChipSmith.com. And, you know, they can feel free to reach out to me there. And you know, if you have any questions about what we do, what we provide, I'd be glad to answer any of those questions for you.
We'll also have Chip and Chip Smith Performance System featured on our website, NFLCombinePrep.com. So there are all kind of places you can go to find his information. Chip, it's an honor and a pleasure. I appreciate you taking time to talk to us today.
Well, Neil, thank you, brother. You've been around a long time, and you do a great job, and you educate a lot of people in the process, and you've helped a lot of young men get the opportunity to play. So I admire you and appreciate our friendship for a long time.
You're very kind, Chip. Have a Merry Christmas, buddy.
Same to you, brother.